Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Merry Corncrakes with your host, Nathan C.J. Hood. Merry Corncrakes is an affiliated podcast or video series to the Corncrake magazine, which is just the most fantastic thing. We're in an age where we're looking to revitalize culture, to retrieve good storytelling. Well, this magazine does that by publishing classic stories and cultural information, while also supporting up and coming independent writers uh, who are online. You can go and find all of this at the Corncrake magazine or corncrakemag.com, and you can see the current monthly edition and all those for the last year or so. Today, we are talking about something which is mentioned in this month's Corncrake, and it is to do with the date, the 17th of April. For those of you who will have seen it, the 17th of April is going to be celebrated as King Arthur Day. At least we at the Corncrake believe that we want to celebrate King Arthur on this day. That's what we want to do. We've kind of appointed it as a day to celebrate King Arthur. And the question is why? Why do we need a day to celebrate King Arthur? Well, we recognize that King Arthur is one of the most important figures in the history and cultures of the British Isles. He's not just somebody that you can ignore or relegate to one distinct group. He's not somebody who is obscure or only those who are deeply educated in the culture of these lands would know about. He's actually, the stories about him, the history and stories about King Arthur have shaped the cultures of the British Isles and of Europe for the best part of 1,000 years. But in particular, the lands of the British Isles. And we can see this if we go into a little bit of the history. The stories of King Arthur, as we know them, are actually a development of a long tradition of literary and artistic creativity. And that prior to the story as we know it today, as it's been kind of retold and refined and synthesized, there was a vast body of histories, myths, and legends. If we're looking at the earliest references to an Arthur, they come from Brittonic poetry. When I say Brittonic, I mean the poetry of the Britons, the Celtic Britons, those people who lived in this land prior to, during, and after the Roman invasion and conquest of Britain. Now, these were not necessarily all one tribe. They belonged to different tribes which warred with each other, but they seem to have shared a certain culture and language. And in the kind of 5th and 6th centuries, as Anglo-Saxon, that is, Germanic tribes started to settle and invade these lands, as they started to push the Celtic Britons out of the east and westward, these people started to tell poems which have been recorded, and they tell of mighty heroes and warriors, pirate kings and mischievous characters, and such a man named Arthur appears in these. In some, he is the ideal warrior, the man to whom all should be compared. In others, he's a bit of a rascal, stealing pigs and causing trouble for clerics. But all in all, he is a kind of magnificent warrior character. He's a bit like Beowulf for the Celtic Britons. And the Celtic Britons, at this time lived in the west of England, particularly in the southwest, in Devon and Cornwall, in Wales, and the south of Scotland. And indeed, many Celtic Britons had moved to Brittany, or what would become Brittany. So the Breton people carried on that tradition. With the arrival of the Scots and the expansion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, this presence was really then pushed into Wales, Cornwall and Devon, and Brittany. And so those people carried on the legends. And in time, there was a belief by these people who were under the oppression of Anglo-Saxon Norman rule that actually Arthur would return, that he would come back from the grave, whether he had ever died or not, open question. He would return and lead these people to victory over their oppressors, and the Britons would re-inherit their land once more. So we can see for these people that Arthur is a very key figure. And indeed, the histories prior to the 1100 kind of confirm this view. When you look at them, Arthur is a character who leads the united armies of the Celtic Britons against the invading Anglo-Saxons, and he wins a series of 12 battles and thus defends the realm for a significant amount of time, halting the Anglo-Saxon expansion. In writers like Nennius, we see this idea develop, and in other sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we hear of Arthur appearing at certain battles, such as the Battle of Badon, probably the most famous battle associated with Arthur, and the Battle of Camlan, where he and a character named Mordred, who would later be identified as his nephew, die in battle. Things progress with this body of poetry and history, and as we move towards the 1100s, the Breton troubadours, who expand their range and network across Europe, are telling the tales of Arthur, so much so that we find in Italy the first visual representations of stories and legends about King Arthur. And these were ramping up. They were being listened to in courts, in taverns, in all the interesting places in the world, in Europe, I should say. And this led various characters, various chroniclers, historians to consider Arthur during this period. We have William of Malmesbury, who, kind of putting aside the supernatural, mythological elements, goes into the history of Arthur as this general who led the resistance against the Anglo-Saxons. But following him, it is Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes one of the most influential books of the period, The History of the Kings of Britain. Charting its mythological beginning with Brutus of Troy, he then expands the Arthurian story and tells of how King Arthur brought together an anarchic land where the robber barons and thieves and bandits were ruling the country. Arthur reunites the British Isles under his rule, establishes justice, and then goes on to conquer large swathes of Europe before being brought down by his nephew Mordred and dying in that battle. Many people didn't just consider this mythology, but actual history. And this story became extremely popular. Geoffrey's work was circulated around the courts of Europe. There's over 200 manuscripts being found of the history of the kings of Britain. And it led to other people writing their own Arthurian stories in a very short amount of time. And very soon we see developments and additions to Geoffrey's depiction. They all work within his framework, but they add new things such as the round table, which all of Arthur's knights would sit at. We get the sword named Excalibur, and of course other characters like Lancelot, Galahad, and the Holy Grail. And this will shape the expectations of people during that period. They come to see themselves in the same world as Arthur and his knights and try to live up to the ideals expressed in those stories. In a way, they see it as a real possibility for their own lives and so model their behavior upon it. Now, for the Anglo-Norman Plantagenet kings, who were descended both from the Norman stock and Anglo-Saxon, the story of Arthur was quite powerful, and indeed something which captured their imagination. Several of them were obsessed and fascinated with King Arthur. And this wasn't just because of the chivalric values and virtues that it displayed, the tournaments and feasting that they could participate in. It was also a kind of myth which they could root their own kingship in and their overlordship of the other nations. They saw themselves as the inheritors, at least in their office as King of England, of Arthur's primary office as King of England. And so they saw themselves as carrying on an Arthurian quest. And so over time, a story which had primarily Brittonic and in that period Welsh and Breton significance became slowly tied into the English identity, and by extension the identity of the Scots, who also had in this period Anglo-Norman nobility and royalty. They also adopted this story too. And this isn't surprising, not least because of the kind of significance for the Plantagenets, but also because many of the events in the Arthurian tale take place in both England and Scotland. So this story of King Arthur has significance for the English, for the Welsh and the Scottish, and I would argue for the Irish as well. And this is in two ways. Firstly, Arthur rules over Ireland at various points in various tales, and so that becomes part of his empire. So when I talk about the British Isles, this is part of it. And this is also seen in other stories like Tristan and Isolde. There's a relationship with the Irish there in these tales. But I think more than that, the influence of Irish mythology, which we have well recorded in various cycles, such as the Ulster cycle. We don't have that for Scotland and England. We don't have that for the rest of the British Isles, the kind of Celtic mythology that informed these people. Well, we do there, and it seems like the motifs and tropes of characters like Finn McCool and Cuchulainn or Cuchulainn, these characters have a direct influence upon the formation of King Arthur. And so there is a sense in which Arthur is a product or a result of a combination of influences of a historical man, of Brittonic legends, of Irish ideals, and Norse ones too. And he's a fusion of all these things brought into an age of chivalry and Plantagenet empire. So for the British Isles, he is a very significant symbol and ideal, which then gets developed over time through the centuries, through the medieval into the Tudor. He becomes very tied to Henry Tudor, who sees himself as a kind of prophetic fulfillment of the return of Arthur. He becomes very important in the Victorian age with the rise of industrialization, making people yearn for a return of Arthur and the glorious England that he stood for, and the natural England, the beauty of England that was being eroded by industrialization. And even in the 20th century, he's been very important. There are many films and many works of art which testify to Arthur and the legends are surrounding him. So I think it is very important, not just for in a general sense, but for the people of the British Isles to have a character which unites us, such as Arthur. He is therefore somebody that we can celebrate in all of his guises and totality. And it's not just Arthur we're celebrating when we kind of raise a glass to him. We're actually looking at the whole tradition, all of the things, all of the exploration of human emotion and feeling and experience and great deeds, all the tragedy and triumph that's within the Arthurian tradition. That's what we celebrate when we celebrate King Arthur Day. So then the second question is, why the 17th of April? Why pick this day? The first thing to say is there isn't really any specific date within the Arthurian mythos, which would have great significance, or there isn't one that immediately jumps out. So we've had to be a bit creative with this. And if you'll permit me, I have to kind of tell a little bit of a story here to justify this date. And we're going back to 1190, or the 1190s, when something quite interesting happened at Glastonbury Abbey. It seems that there had been a legend which a bard told the Plantagenet king Henry II that King Arthur was buried at Glastonbury Abbey. And so Henry had passed this on to the monks of Glastonbury, who, following a great fire which destroyed their abbey, they needed to raise funds. And so it was suggested, why don't we try and find the graves of Arthur? So they got to digging, and a contemporary tells the story of how they dug down deeply, and first they found a wooden cross, which was inscribed with saying that here lies Arthur and Guinevere, or King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. They then dug deeper, and they found a coffin made out of an oaken trunk. It was shaped like an oaken trunk. It was basically an oak trunk hollowed out. And inside they found two skeletons. One was a giant man with cracks in his bones, and the other was a lady with little strands of blonde hair still on her head. And so they believed that this was Arthur and Guinevere. And they used this information to, say, okay, we've got relics here. This was the age where people would travel on pilgrimage to holy relics, such as bones and objects associated with saints and Christ, which they believed had power to convey certain things, such as spiritual blessing and healing, and so on. So, in a way, the monks were presenting these bones as if as Arthur and Guinevere, and saying, okay, you can come to Glastonbury and see these bones. And this kind of connection that Henry II made between Arthur and Glastonbury isn't totally far-fetched. There is a lot of the Welsh kind of poetry which locates Arthur as a character who would have lived around that area. And certainly Glastonbury at that time was the preeminent church in Britain when Arthur was around. Is it inconceivable that he could be buried there? And what's more, the historian Geoffrey Ashe, who is a very good scholar, he, I think, quite convincingly argued that while the cross that was found at Arthur's grave was probably fraudulent, the story about the skeletons in the oaken trunk has a plausibility to it. Firstly, the contemporary who describes this was a skeptic who believed that these had been found. And secondly, it was a practice of the Celtic Britons to bury some of their dead in trunks, oaken trunks. So this could quite possibly be some kind of Celtic chief who they have found, or a mighty Celtic warrior. So whether or not it is Arthur and Guinevere, it's certainly somebody who could fit that profile. 100 years pass, or the best part of 100 years. Arthur and Guinevere are reburied, and we move forward to the reign of Edward I, or Edward Longshanks, as the Scots would call him. Now, he was fascinated with Arthurian mythology. He read many of the tales. He tried to live it in his own life, having round table feasts and tournaments. He tried to reunite the kingdoms under his lordship of the British Isles. And he engaged in quite an extraordinary ceremony on the 17th of April in 1278. On that date, which was Easter Day, he visited Glastonbury Abbey with his wife, Queen Eleanor, and they had exhumed the bones of Arthur and Guinevere at Glastonbury. They then had them in for people to do homage and reverence to. They then reburied them in a new tomb, which bore their seals. And that this new tomb was magnificent. It apparently had an effigy of Arthur, but unfortunately was destroyed during the Reformation. And I haven't been able to find this out specifically, but I reckon it's around the time that Thomas Cromwell had Glastonbury Abbey closed, had its abbot executed in the most horrifying way, and plundered its wealth for himself and for his companions. The ceremony that Edward performed had a dual function. Firstly, it identified Edward and Eleanor as the successors of Arthur and Guinevere. They were carrying on his legacy. They were the fulfillment, the continuation of the legend of King Arthur. But second, and thus he was the rightful kind of overlord, not only of England, but of Scotland and Wales and Ireland. Secondly, it put to bed the Welsh idea that Arthur would return, because Edward's saying, no, here are his bones. He's not coming to save you from my rule. And what is more, I've placed my seal upon his tomb. I have shut him in the ground forever. So this date is quite significant in the legend of King Arthur. It's very tied to King Arthur. And I think it is quite appropriate for that reason, this idea that Arthur being brought back into the present, at least in 1278, his significance mattering, and homage being done to him in the same way we can do that as well. There is a second connection, and this is purely accidental, because it would only happen every so often, every few years. It couldn't be something that it doesn't happen every year. And that is the fact that 17th of April, that, let me just double check this. It is, I believe, yes, a Thursday. The 17th of April is also Maundy Thursday in the Christian calendar. And that is the date when Christians remember and celebrate the Last Supper of Jesus Christ before his crucifixion and then resurrection. So it's part of the Easter cycle, the Passion narrative. And at the Last Supper, Jesus did something which has been a part of Christian worship for 2,000 years. He took bread of the Paschal meal, he broke it, and then he said, "Take, eat, this is my body broken for you, or given for you, do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup of wine and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant, drink this for the forgiveness of sins," and so on. Now, in the late 1100s, early 1200s, there was this idea that in the Arthurian mythos of a grail, or the Holy Grail. Now, initially, this grail didn't have a specific Christian significance. It drew on both pagan and Christian ideas of a magical vessel which can breathe new life into a land, into a people, into an individual, that it's a healing thing. And there are various kind of cauldrons and so on that could have inspired this. But certain Christian writers of the time period, like Robert de Boron, kind of melded this with a Christian history. They argued that Joseph of Arimathea, one of Jesus's disciples, took the cup used at the Last Supper and through various travels ended up in Britain. And there, Joseph of Arimathea founded Glastonbury Abbey, or at least one of his descendants did. And that this then was the Holy Grail that the knights of the Round Table would go in search of as the highest mystical object and the means by which they could communicate with the divine. Now, there are other versions of the story, such as Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach. which don't have that significance. But it certainly seems that there was a line, an idea that was cemented at that point that the Holy Grail was the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, and that this is identified with Glastonbury, in part because there was, prior to that, a legend that Joseph of Arimathea had established the church at Glastonbury very soon after the events of the New Testament. So this idea of the Holy Grail connects with Maundy Thursday, and so we feel it's not in competition, but actually complements the Easter celebrations, which are very deeply rooted in this country, by also celebrating King Arthur on that day. So, how to celebrate King Arthur Day? Well, we have a couple of suggestions. The first is you will see that I've been wearing a cross throughout this. Now, this cross is a little pin badge, if I can show you now, which you can see it has Latin writing on it. It is made in the shape and has the writing from the cross found at Glastonbury at Arthur's grave. Now, as I've said to you, this may well very be a forgery, but nonetheless it is connected to the legend of Arthur, to the date which we are celebrating from 1278, when Arthur was exhumed by Edward I. And so we feel this is a little symbol of Arthur. And you can buy these online for less than £10. I will put a link in the description below. It is made in the southwest, and again, that's where Arthur may well have been if he was a historical figure. So I think this is a very good way to kind of show your support for King Arthur Day. But the second thing is to sing or recite a particular hymn. And this song is Jerusalem by William Blake. Now, this is a kind of loose connection. We realize that there isn't like a particular song for King Arthur. There isn't one that has been made. And it would be difficult to write a new song, especially as not everyone knows it. But we feel that Jerusalem fits very well with King Arthur, not least for two reasons. Firstly, the song kind of draws on a legend that Jesus Christ actually came to England. And this idea that Jesus came to England it's widely thought was inspired by the idea that Joseph of Arimathea came to England and in England established Glastonbury. And there's also a sense that, well, if Christ came, he also came to Glastonbury, which we know is associated with Arthur. So there is a very kind of tangential relationship there to the Arthurian mythos with Christ coming to Glastonbury. And this isn't totally kind of absurd, because if the Holy Grail came to Glastonbury, well, what is presented in the Holy Grail in the kind of Christian interpretation, in the Mass, the bread and wine are transformed in substance, not in form, in appearance, but in substance, into the body and blood of Christ. So the Holy Grail brings Christ, as it were, to Glastonbury. So this is almost a variation of that idea. But more than that, the hymn has an Arthurian feel in terms of the imagery it uses, kind of medieval, powerful medieval imagery of war and warriorship, but also in terms of its ideals of restoring Britain once more, or England once more. And we feel that's very central to the Arthurian mythos, with this idea that Arthur will return. So let me read the words to you just now, and you will perhaps see what I'm saying. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. We may well say, we will not cease from mental fight, nor shall our sword sleep in our hands, till we have built Camelot once more in Britain's green and pleasant lands. That is the spirit of King Arthur Day. So go forth and celebrate in what way you can. I would encourage you to buy the pin. I'd encourage you to recite this hymn. And if you want to find out more, you can watch the videos from Arthur Day that I did last year, where there's tons of content on all the aspects of King Arthur. You can go and read the poems and stories. You can choose one and go and read it. But most of all, my friends, think of Arthur, celebrate the memory of all he stands for, and go forth and do likewise as he would have done today. Thank you again. Go and read the Corncrake at thecorncrakemag.com, and we shall catch up again soon.